Let me tell you about Tetrisphere.
It's 1995!
And at the Consumer Electronics Show, a game called Fear is being showcased by Atari for their hype machine at the time, the Atari Jaguar.
Game system with 64 bits of awesome power! This irresponsible...
Atari's last horse in the hardware development race that was dead on arrival, even though technically it was the strongest one running in it at the time. After being impressed with its demo at the event, the game's rights were swiped by Nintendo, who began exclusively working with the developer H2O Interactive, announcing it as the subject of today's video during the Nintendo Space World event just a few months later, slated for an October 1996 release for their own new upcoming hardware, the Ultra 64. In spite of that rough transition and missing its initial window release by 8 months, the game upon release was not only the first Tetris game on the console, I'd argue it stands above as the most interesting among a crop of Tetris games the N64 got, if not amidst the bevy of puzzle games on the console as a whole. I'm talking about the gem from 1997, Tetrisphere. Happy Mother's Day. Now, I know you got a couple questions on your mind. What the fuck does Tetris, let alone Tetrisphere, have to do with Mother's Day? And why aren't you playing Tears of the Kingdom right now, you Zelda-loving schmuck? Well, Tetris has been a core part of my upbringing, my life in general. Hell, today's video was gonna be a Mother's Day special about Tetris as a whole by doing a tier time on every single iteration of Tetris that I've played throughout my life. I'm shelving that idea in lieu of doing something a little more focalized into something that, like, I know my mom can appreciate a little more, because my mom loves Tetris. That's like one of 3 games that I know she is like a huge fan of. This copy of Tetrisphere is technically hers, but I have the N64, so I have the game. But Tetrisphere is a gem on the N64, and it's one that I have a lot of memories tied to with my mom, because while, yes, I played Tetris on the Game Boy a lot, I played Tetris on the NES when we had an NES, and there are a bunch of other versions of Tetris I played throughout my life, this was on heavy rotation in my household, because it's such a unique version of Tetris that, like, when looking at footage of the other Tetrises, Wet Tricks aside, I've never played Wet Tricks, but it looks like a really interesting game. This just kind of stands far and above as a really interesting look into, like, early N64 games. When doing research and learning that this was a proof of concept originally made for the Atari Jaguar, this game made a lot more sense, because while, like, using 3D graphics in a bunch of different ways is kind of a big shtick with the N64 as a whole, there are aspects of Tetrisphere, namely, like, the cast of robot characters, the bowling alley-ass animations that happen throughout the hide-and-seek mode, and generally the aesthetic of this game doesn't radiate wholly an N64 vibe. The soundtrack itself feels very tangential from Tetris as a whole, so to learn that it was something else entirely originally kind of makes a little bit of sense. I don't know. This game has always been an enigma to me because it's such a weird version of Tetris, but it's such a fun one. The big reason why I decided to make solely this and shelve the tier time outside of knowing that my mom also really likes Tetrisphere is when recording B-roll for said Tetris tier time, I had done a little bit of Tetris. I'd done a little bit of Tetris 99. I played a handful of rounds of both. I played this for like 2 hours because there was like a lot to this game, and while I didn't need to show it all off, when I was sitting down to play it, I was curious. I just played more of the game than I had intended to because I just generally like the layout of this game. You know, I think that the whole fisheye lens approach to the camera, which was done to make the game run smoother on the N64 to help alleviate the workload that doing a game like this on that console would do. It also gives it this very mid-90s look. You know, you had that Sonic game that was canceled on the Saturn that shared this. Skate videos were fucking huge. Skate culture was right around the corner. This game just kind of fits in that niche in such a strangely satisfying way, because it still evokes Tetris and how satisfying it is to play this game well. Tetrisphere's gameplay is a weird sort of inverse on the Tetris formula. There are no falling blocks, you are the falling block, but you're being controlled by the aforementioned robots that just set the aesthetic of this game outside of pockets of the N64. And they all do have different stats and they play differently, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic to explore. Instead of seeing the whole board essentially controlling the block to that pocket, you're instead, through the POV of the falling block, trying to find a place to land that lines up with other blocks of that type. It's a sort of chain reaction style of Tetris where you're kind of picking through a Tetris ball. It's an interesting gameplay loop that is incredibly satisfying when done well, and can be set up in a way to just be a very visually pleasing experience. There's also weapons that you can pick up amidst this as well that grow in intensity, and it's all to just get to the core faster. And those ideas kind of collide into this fun, engaging experience where the better you do, the better your weapons get. Finding weapons in the field and upgrading them creates this dynamic, and they stack to some pretty insane weapons. On top of that, the ways that they flip that concept into different gameplay modes is kind of interesting, because you do have the sort of just endurance mode where you have to just survive throughout a variety of piece switch-ups and layer densities. In lieu of having a marathon mode, they instead have a time trial sort of speedrun mode where you try to just clear to the core as many times as possible without screwing up. And they've got this mode where you have to basically become the wizard pondering the orb in the puzzle mode and trying to solve these puzzles with very strict rule sets. There's the hide and seek mode where the sort of meat of what it feels like the Jaguar original Fierce was going to be, where there's different things on the orb that you have to interact with or seek out, like a different sized core piece or connecting core pieces. There's one where you have to manipulate the core image itself to create the image of the core. There's a lot of flips on this simple concept that I think are really interesting when playing in a meaty session. Also, the multiplayer is tense as hell. I have played that with my mom on the channel back in the day. It's just really intense when playing with somebody whose skill set you kind of match, because you're sending pieces back and forth, and the whole point of the game is to make the other person screw up 3 times or uncover more core than they do at like a cap. It's a really challenging game mode. And I remember even when I wasn't playing this as a kid, I would watch my mom play with her friends. It was really fun to watch. And it was something that was fun to master, or has been fun to master over the years. It's also, if I'm being honest, one of the most fun puzzle games to just practice, because the practice mode is such a peaceful look at the orb and sort of learning how the pieces operate together. It's a really interesting way to just let you play with the engine. Every time I sit down to play this, it ends up being a session like that, because it's just really fun to go through another time trial, pick up where I left off in another mode. There's a lot of like episodes in this. This is a dense like campaign mode. You've got to capture like every robot as a robot. There's so many different puzzles. There's episodes for every single game mode, and there's so many of them. It's still a game that I cherish dearly, and I think that it is very much a hidden gem in the console. I originally put it on my N64 games list because I do think that it is a robust spin on the classic Tetris formula. And while I said the soundtrack feels different, it is a great soundtrack. I really love the electronic jams on here. There's some of the funkier jams as well that I think are pretty good, but I think that, like, as far as spinning an electronic soundtrack together, that evokes that mid-90s energy, like early Prodigy and the sort. It very much falls in line with that, and I think that it's a pretty decent game soundtrack of its style. While, again, it's pretty simple in concept and kind of maybe strange to talk about in a classic breakdown like this, I think that if I'm going to celebrate Tetris, I'm going to talk about one of its biggest oddities, and I would definitely say Tetrisphere is its biggest oddity. In an era where puzzle games were kind of evolving in their own sense, I like where Tetris went in the mid-90s, because while, again, it was everywhere, some of those deviations just really stood far and above to me as some of the most interesting and memorable parts of my gaming past. And that's my thoughts on Tetrisphere. Did you like this video? Did you not? Let me know in the comments down below. Have you played Tetrisphere? If not, please do. Seek it out if you've got an N64. It's worth it. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. I'm gonna go. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.